Despite the cutesiness of my title, there is a method to my madness. Stating the obvious, the vast majority of all the jazz that's ever been played has been constructed from the same 12 notes. Here's 10 of them, arranged to form a scale which you may never have heard before. I'm going to show you how I arrived at those 10 notes and what the point of it is, but first, if you're new here, my name is Chase Sanborn and I'm a jazz trumpet player based in Toronto. In this video, I talked about how almost all chords can be assigned to one of three categories, which I call the big three: major 7, dominant 7, and minor 7. The point of that is to help you understand the function of individual chords within a chord progression and to simplify the massive information that you encounter as a jazz student, especially if you're trying to do this as an older person. I'm going to do something similar now by assigning the 12 notes of the chromatic scale to three categories. The first is chord tones, which are the notes that define the chord. We'll use a C dominant 7 chord as an example, and if you don't know what that means, then I encourage you to go back and watch some of my previous videos where I lay the groundwork for where we're going to go in this one. The chord tones of a C dominant 7 are C, E, G, and B flat, which are the root, 3rd, 5th, and lowered 7th in the key of C. I'm talking and displaying in B flat pitch, so these are the notes that I'm actually playing on my trumpet. If I use only these 4 chord tones to improvise on a track that contains only one chord, my melodic possibilities are pretty limited. Harmonically, though, improvising with only chord tones pretty much guarantees that your notes will work with the chord changes. And when you're learning to improvise on a tune, it's a great first step to play only chord tones. That'll also put an emphasis on your rhythm, which ultimately has an even greater impact on how your solo will be perceived by a listener. As I talked about in this video, the C dominant 7 chord comes from a C mixolydian scale, which contains the notes of the chord plus the remaining notes from the C major scale. Those notes are D, F, and A, which represent the 2nd, 4th, and 6th notes of the scale. Those additional 3 notes, when they're used in the context of a melodic line, are called diatonic passing tones. They lie between and they connect the chord tones. This is the second group of notes, added to the chord tones and bringing the total up to 7. They're called diatonic because they exist within the key center as defined by the scale from which the chord is derived, in this case, a C mixolydian scale. They have a harmonic function as well when they're added to a chord voicing, and in that context we call them extensions or tensions, and we number them 9, 11, and 13 as they would appear in the second octave of the scale. With the combination of chord tones and diatonic passing tones, the melodic possibilities are greatly expanded. In this video, I showed you how the vast majority of Chet Baker's lines in a couple of examples are almost entirely diatonic. The key thing is to understand the relationship between the two kinds of notes. One group defines the chord, and the other group adds color to it. In terms of understanding the relationship of chord tones to passing tones in a melodic line, you may have heard the suggestion that chord tones should occur on the downbeats or on the strong beats of the bar. And if you look at a transcription of any solo in which the harmony is clearly communicated, you'll see that this is true a lot of the time. But like a lot of jazz pedagogy, this represents analysis after the fact, and it's not necessarily reflective of what's in the mind of the improviser. It comes down to conscious versus subconscious information. You can't effectively use what you know, and certainly not in a spontaneous activity like jazz improvisation, until you no longer have to think about it on a conscious level. After you input information, and that includes watching something like this video, it's the repeated application of the information that eventually lodges it in the subconscious. For younger people, this is easier to accept. So much of their life is about inputting and applying information. For older people who are learning to improvise, impatience often creeps in. If I tell you something like chord tones should occur on the downbeats, you want to know, how do I do that? Unfortunately, the answer may not be all that satisfying. You've just got to keep at it. acknowledge the baby steps along the way, and slowly, over time, things start to clarify. Now, I've said it before on this channel. I've been doing this professionally for almost 50 years, and I still feel like I'm just getting a grasp on some of the more basic elements of jazz improvisation, like how to craft a diatonic line that adheres to the harmony and yet is melodically coherent. Anyway, let's plunge ahead with the third group of notes. We'll start with another test to see if you can identify this 8-note scale. People often mistake this for a bebop scale, but in fact it isn't any scale that I know of. To arrive at it, I took the 4 chord tones and I preceded each one by a chromatic half step from below. Chromatic approach and passing tones are the third group of notes. And in this video, I showed you how they form the underpinning for Clifford Brown's style of improvisation. If we take just the approach notes, they form a dominant 7 chord that is a half step below C7, which is B7, and that consists of B, D sharp, F sharp, and A. If I play the C7 and the B7 arpeggios simultaneously, the sound is going to be pretty dissonant. If I move each of the notes of the B7 to the adjacent note in the C7, we hear tension and then resolution. Of the 4 notes that form a B dominant 7 chord, one of them, A, is already in the C mixolydian scale. So we've now introduced 3 new notes added to the previous 7, and that gives us the 10-note scale that I started out with in the beginning. I hesitate to even call this a scale. It's just a group of 10 notes that contain chord tones, diatonic passing tones, and non-diatonic or chromatic passing tones. So we have no name for these notes arranged in this particular order, but from these 10 notes we can form several scales that we are familiar with. We know that the C mixolydian scale exists within them, and if we add just the B natural to the C mixolydian scale, we get the C bebop scale. If we take the 1st, 4th, 5th, and 7th notes of the mixolydian scale, and then add the D sharp, which we'll call the enharmonic equivalent E flat, we get the C minor pentatonic scale. If we add the F sharp to the C minor pentatonic scale, we get the C blues scale. My point is not to say look at all the scales that can be used over a C dominant 7 chord, but rather look at all the notes you have to choose from, which is all the notes. Given that I'm working with 10 of the 12 available notes, there's only 2 others, and they are C sharp and G sharp. Now, if you're familiar with a C altered dominant chord, those notes appear as the flat 9 and the flat 13, or the sharp 5. In a non-altered context, like we're hearing in this track, those notes are going to sound pretty dissonant, but they can absolutely be used as chromatic passing tones between adjacent diatonic notes. If there's a way to use all 12 notes on a given chord, then we could say that the only scale that an improviser needs to know is the chromatic scale, whence the title of this video. The key is to understand the relationship of each of those notes to the chord. Is it a chord tone, or is it a diatonic passing tone drawn from the scale from which the chord is derived, or is it one of the 5 non-diatonic notes that lie outside the scale? Music theory can give us the answer to that question, but more importantly, your ear knows the difference. If you play one of the chord tones, your natural instinct will be that it fits as if you put a round peg in a round hole. If you play one of the diatonic passing notes, it won't sound like it fits the chord quite as comfortably, but it probably won't sound wrong per se because it's in the overall tonality. If you play one of the non-diatonic passing tones, the dissonance will likely push your ear in the direction of resolution that happens if you move it up or down to a nearby diatonic note. Now, I will say that if your ear is attuned to jazz harmony, you might well hear a passing tone as part of the chord. It's rare to hear a jazz voicing without some extensions added, and if, for example, the 9 or the 13 is heard within the voicing, then it may feel completely comfortable to just sit on those notes. It's actually a beautiful sound, although it's still somewhat distinct from the chord tones. You might even hear one of the non-diatonic notes as part of the chord, particularly if it's played as part of the chord voicing. For example, the F sharp represents a sharp 11 on a C dominant 7 chord. Well, that's a common extension, and you may well hear it as a perfectly acceptable color. On the other hand, the B natural represents the major 7 on a dominant 7 chord, and that's probably not a note that you're going to want to sit on, lying as it does directly between 2 chord tones. But if you play it, and then you let it move to one of those 2 chord tones, you hear the tension and the resolution that I demonstrated earlier, and that makes your lines interesting. So far, all the examples I've played have been over a single chord, a C dominant 7. Now that's useful in hearing the way that the 3 different groups of notes sound in relation to the chord, but when we're improvising over a chord progression, every time the chord changes, so do the notes that make up the 3 groups. So now I'll improvise over a very common chord progression based on the song There Will Never Be Another You. First, I'll try to improvise entirely diatonically using only the 7 notes of the key signature, which for me is F. On every chord, there will always be at least some chord tones and diatonic passing tones that can be found in the F major scale. I'll note that in the melody to this tune, there is only one note that is non-diatonic, and that occurs on one beat of 1 bar. So it's certainly possible to improvise using only the notes of the key, but that doesn't mean it's easy to come up with something that sounds good. Rather than play a lot of notes, my instinct is to play fewer and to try to let the melodic line guide me. On the next chorus, I'll give myself free rein to use any of the 12 notes on any of the chords. That lets me target chord tones that may be outside the key and also to use chromatic passing tones to give shape and interest to my lines. And if you haven't seen my video on Clifford, you should watch that one next to see how he used those notes to fantastic effect. Just before I play this, let me say that if the information in this video is helpful, well, you'll find a lot more of it in Jazz Tactics, and book sales help support the channel. If you'd like instruction that is specific to you, I offer private lessons on Zoom. And if you're able to drop $1 or $2 into the tip jar by clicking the thanks button, your financial support and especially your vote of confidence is much appreciated. You can find out more and get in touch by visiting chasesanborn.com and the links in the description. As I play another chorus, now would be the perfect time to click the like button and to let me know what you think in the comments.